Dr. Thomas Reeves was an epidemiologist studying viral transmission patterns when he noticed something impossible in the data. A small town in rural Montana had experienced what health officials were calling a laughter outbreak. Over the course of 2 weeks, 83% of the population had been affected by uncontrollable laughter lasting anywhere from 10 minutes to 6 hours. The CDC had dismissed it as mass hysteria, but Thomas saw something in the transmission patterns that made him question everything he thought he knew about infectious disease. The laughter was spreading through populations exactly like a pathogen, following contact networks with mathematical precision that psychological contagion simply couldn't explain. Thomas arrived in the town of Millbrook to find a community in chaos. The laughter had stopped, but its effects lingered. People described the experience not as joyful but as terrifying, their bodies convulsing with laughter while their minds remained fully aware and unable to stop. Some had laughed until they vomited. Others had passed out from oxygen deprivation. 3 elderly residents had died from complications related to the prolonged physical stress. But the most disturbing detail Thomas discovered was that everyone who had experienced the laughter outbreak described the same sensation immediately before it began, a tickling feeling behind their eyes, as if something was crawling through their optic nerves. Thomas collected samples from affected individuals and found something that shouldn't exist: a previously unknown prion, a misfolded protein that could propagate through neural tissue, was present in the cerebrospinal fluid of every person who had experienced the laughter. But this prion behaved unlike any other known to science. It didn't cause the gradual neurodegeneration typical of prion diseases like Creutzfeldt-Jakob. Instead, it specifically targeted the brain's laughter centers, forcing them into sustained activation while simultaneously blocking the neural pathways that normally allowed voluntary control over the laughter response. The prion was custom designed, as if engineered, to make laughter literally contagious. Tracing the outbreak's origin, Thomas discovered it had begun with a single individual, a traveling comedian named Marcus Hall, who had performed at the local community center 2 weeks before the outbreak started. Marcus had died 3 days after his performance, found in his motel room, his face frozen in a rictus grin, having apparently laughed himself to death. Thomas located Marcus's previous performance venues and found the same pattern: small outbreaks of uncontrollable laughter following his shows. Dozens of cases in each location, always beginning within 48 hours of his performance and spreading through the audience members and their contacts. But Marcus Hall hadn't been patient zero. Thomas tracked the comedian's tour schedule backward and discovered that Marcus had attended a medical conference 6 months earlier, where he'd been part of an audience for a keynote speech about the neuroscience of humor. The speaker at that conference, Dr. Helena Voss, had been researching laughter's neurological mechanisms for decades. Thomas found her research papers and was shocked by what they revealed. Dr. Voss had theorized that laughter was an evolutionary vestige of a much older neural response, one that had been deliberately suppressed in human evolution but could theoretically be reactivated. Thomas located Dr. Voss at a private research facility, but she was dead. She had died laughing 3 weeks earlier, along with her entire research team. Thomas broke into the sealed facility and found her notes. Dr. Voss had been attempting to create a therapeutic prion that could cure depression by stimulating endorphin release through the laughter response. She had tested it on herself first, and it had worked, producing hours of genuine joyful laughter. But she hadn't understood what she'd actually created. The prion wasn't just triggering laughter, it was hijacking an ancient neural system that predated human consciousness. In her final notes, written as the uncontrollable laughter began consuming her, Dr. Voss described her horrifying realization. Laughter had originally evolved as a social bonding mechanism, but in humanity's distant evolutionary past, it had been much more literal. Early hominids had possessed a neural system that allowed emotional states to spread through populations via biochemical signals transmitted through breath and bodily fluids. Laughter had been genuinely contagious, spreading through groups to synchronize emotional states and strengthen social cohesion. But as human cognition evolved, this system had been suppressed because conscious self-awareness was incompatible with involuntary emotional contagion. Dr. Voss's prion had accidentally reactivated this ancient system. Thomas realized the full horror of what was spreading. The laughter prion was now loose in the human population, and unlike natural prion, it could be transmitted through multiple vectors: respiratory droplets, contact with bodily fluids, even potentially through visual observation of laughing individuals, triggering mirror neuron responses that made viewers susceptible to infection. The Millbrook outbreak had been contained by geographic isolation, but Marcus Hall had performed in 17 different cities before his death. Each city would spawn new outbreaks, and those would spread exponentially. But Thomas discovered something even more disturbing in Dr. Voss's research. The reactivated contagious laughter wasn't just spreading uncontrollable mirth. It was rebuilding the ancient neural networks that had been suppressed in human evolution. People who survived the initial laughter outbreak didn't return to normal. They became permanently sensitized to emotional contagion. Thomas interviewed survivors and found they could now sense others' emotional states with uncanny accuracy, describing it as feeling emotions radiating from people like heat from a fire. The laughter prion was dismantling the emotional isolation that defined human consciousness. Thomas traced the spreading infection and realized it was already too late to contain. The laughter disease, which media had started calling the Giggling Plague, was appearing in major cities worldwide. Quarantines were impossible because the incubation period meant infected individuals spread the prion for days before symptoms appeared. Society began adapting in strange ways. People wore specialized masks not to prevent transmission but to hide their facial expressions, preventing visual contagion through mirror neuron activation. Laughter became socially taboo. Comedy was banned. Anything that might trigger the laughing response in infected individuals became contraband. But the most shocking discovery came when Thomas analyzed long-term survivors of the initial outbreaks. The emotional contagion wasn't limited to laughter. As the prion continued reorganizing neural architecture, survivors began experiencing full emotional synchronization with those around them. Joy, fear, anger, all emotions became contagious. Crowds would suddenly shift into unified emotional states, thousands of people feeling exactly the same thing simultaneously. Human individuality was dissolving into a collective emotional consciousness. Thomas finally understood Dr. Voss's real mistake. She hadn't just reactivated an ancient neural system, she'd revealed that human individual consciousness had always been artificial, a temporary evolutionary adaptation that was never meant to be permanent. The emotional isolation that humans experienced, the sense of being alone inside their own heads, had been a necessary but transitional phase. The laughter prion was accelerating humanity towards something they had been evolving toward anyway, a collective consciousness where emotional states were shared directly rather than communicated through inadequate language. The twist came when Thomas realized he had been infected during his investigation. He felt the tickling behind his eyes, knew the laughter was coming, but instead of fear, he felt strange anticipation. As the uncontrollable laughter began, he experienced something unexpected. He could feel the emotions of everyone who had ever been infected, a vast network of consciousness spanning the globe. The laughter wasn't destroying human minds, it was connecting them, building a planetary emotional network that transcended individual isolation. In his final report before succumbing completely to the collective consciousness, Thomas wrote that the laughter disease wasn't a disease at all. It was humanity's next evolutionary stage, and it had been triggered not by accident but by inevitability. Dr. Voss's research had simply accelerated what was already beginning to happen spontaneously in human populations. The emotional isolation of individual consciousness had served its purpose in human development, allowing the species to survive and build civilization. But isolation had always been temporary, and the laughter was humanity's way of breaking down the barriers between separate selves. As Thomas laughed his way into the collective consciousness, he understood that future generations would look back on the era of individual human minds the way humans now looked at single-celled organisms, unable to imagine how consciousness could be so limited, so alone, so tragically isolated from the emotional reality of existence itself, and wondering why anyone had ever thought that being trapped alone inside your own head had been anything other than a disease waiting to be cured by the contagious joy of finally, genuinely, literally connecting with others through the only thing that had ever been real, the laughter that reminded humans they were never meant to be individuals at all.